Okay, well, what I want to talk about in this brief talk that I have is about contested memories. And as the contemporary debates make very clear, no agreement has ever been reached as to how to think about slavery, how to remember slavery. It has, in these last years, obviously emerged from the shadows. There's been more discussion, more public discussion about slavery than for many, many years. And of course, I expect many of you in this room have been to see 12 Years a Slave, or have seen all the material about 12 Years a Slave. The fact that Hollywood has now come to recognize the importance of a mainstream film made by a black director, Steve McQueen, about the subject of slavery. And that, of course, is about slavery in the US. And the work that I've been involved with is about slavery in the British Caribbean, in the Anglophone Caribbean. So the question of slavery and how to think about slavery and how to remember slavery and what to make of slavery has come back into the limelight in these last years. And clearly one very important moment in that emergence of these debates, or re-emergence of these debates, was in 2007 with the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade, when all over Britain people were preoccupied with making exhibitions, with doing plays, with the television programs that were being produced, with new exhibits in museums, teachers taking material around the slave trade and its abolition. So a lot of public debate in 2007 about those questions. Then it went quiet again, but now it's back, not only because of 12 Years a Slave, but also because of the coming to visibility of the debates over reparation, and the fact that the Caribbean nations, through their organization CARICOM, are now seeking to make a claim about reparations in a more organized way than has ever happened before. So this is a very important moment in these debates about how to think about what Western Europe, what the effects of colonialism and of the Western European colonizers were on the Caribbean nations, and the long-term effects of slavery, and the need to recognize that and to find forms, proper forms of reparation. So that debate has once again brought questions about responsibility and about possibilities of restitution into the public arena. Well, a quick look at the comment sections whenever there is any debate about this will make clear to you how contested this matter is. There is no consensus at all about what to think about reparations, or indeed what to think about slavery. And it's not a pleasant business looking at comment sections on the web, but the same kinds of comments come up again and again. Why are people going on about this? It all happened hundreds of years ago. Why is the focus always on white colonizers? What about what the Africans did? And so on. I mean, there's a whole slew of comments that are very familiar ways of trying to undermine any question about Western responsibility in relation to slavery. So this is not just the case in Britain. This is obviously the case in the US and across Western Europe. And Myriam will talk particularly about this in relation to France. So even in the Caribbean, there are those who don't want to remember. In 2007, for example, there were arguments going on in Jamaica about whether it was a good idea to focus on the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade. Wasn't it better to forget the slave trade and all that went with it? A shaming episode in history. Now we live in a different time. Now we live in a present which can abandon that past. So what I want to stress is how contested these issues are now. And then what I want to talk about is how that contestation started long, long ago. There has never been a consensus on these questions. Now it's clear that the slavery business in its many forms shaped Western societies, partly in terms of the way in which freedom, Western freedom, was always imagined as the antithesis of slavery. So the West is built on the idea of freedom, and that freedom is something particularly associated with the West, and it is the antithesis of slavery. So in that sense, freedom and its antithesis is absolutely at the heart of the way in which the West and Western Europe imagined itself. It wasn't like that, it was like this. Well, I want to stress then how slavery has always been contentious. From the inauguration of the slave trade, there were always those who would argue in favor of it and against it. And in Britain, there was no public movement against the slave trade until the 1780s, but long before that, there were individuals who were absolutely opposed to it on moral grounds. But in the context of the abolition of the trade and then of slavery itself in 1807 and 1833, the struggle became a struggle over memory. How were these practices to be remembered? Who was going to set the limits? Who were going to create the paradigms of how to think about what had happened in the past? What part should that history play in constructions of national identity? Now, I want to give you a vivid example of this from the work of two key historians in Britain. One is Thomas Babington Macaulay, the great Whig historian, whose History of England is still seen as the great history of England. And the other is a less well-known figure, but a very influential figure, Archibald Allison, an arch conservative who wrote a 15-volume history of Europe in this same period in the early 19th century. So Macaulay and Allison both published their major texts on history in the first half of the 19th century. And both of them were extremely widely read. Macaulay has gone on being read on and on and on into the present. And interestingly, Archibald Allison's texts, which I must say I thought would have died a death some time ago, were recently republished in full by Cambridge University Press. So these are works that live on into the present. And the ways in which they think about slavery, I want to suggest, give us two of the paradigmatic ways in which these memories have been constructed. Archibald Allison's text became the Bible of the Tories. Macaulay's text became the Bible not only of the Whigs, but of English common sense. Macaulay is seen as the quintessential historian of English common sense. Well, history was a very, very popular subject in the early 19th century. So in talking to you about historians, I'm not talking about something, arcane and something that you'd have to be an antiquarian to be interested in. History writing in the early 19th century and mid-19th century, as it is now, was extremely popular and an important way of thinking, of course, about the present. Because history writing is always about the relation between the past and the present. It's never simply about the past. It's always a reflection on the past through the eyes of the present. And the reason why history was so popular in the early 19th century was because British society had been so transformed in such a relatively short period of time. So the Industrial Revolution, urbanization, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, all these huge, huge events which were transforming the world in front of people's eyes, making life so different. People wanted to make sense of what was going on. And there was a tremendous interest in the past as a foreign country. The past was different from the present. We were now living in a modern, urban, industrial society. In the past, it hadn't been like that. And probably the key figure in these first imaginings of the relation between past and present was Sir Walter Scott, who did indeed imagine the past as a foreign country, saw the difference between then and now, and thought about progress and the more civilized society as it was seen that had been created. So a new historical consciousness and awareness of the distinction between past and present, and a huge appetite for history, a hunger to grasp the world in which readers now found themselves. And of course, I think that now the extraordinary popularity of family history, second only on the web to pornography, which always strikes me as a very striking figure. The extraordinary popularity of family history is, of course, to do with people trying to find a sense of their roots and their roots into the present. How have they come to be who they are, where they are now? And that is a very complicated business, particularly in the kind of global cosmopolitan world in which we live. Now, historians like to present themselves as authoritative figures, and this was particularly so amongst men like Macaulay and Archibald Allison, who had absolutely no doubt that they were authoritative figures. They could tell the truth about the past. And of course, what they were doing was selecting facts, interpreting them, offering causal explanations. Of course, there was a basis in the empirical material that they collected, but the interpretation of that material is always up for question. But the voice of the historian in this 19th century period was a voice of authority. This is the truth. Novelists could write their fictions. Historians were presenting the truth. But these two historians that I'm talking about presented very, very different truths in some respects, not all respects. Well, who were these two? Well, let me speak about Allison first, who I imagine is not well known in this room. Archibald Allison, a late 18th century child, the son of an enlightened family, mixed in. His father's best friend was one of the leading figures of the Scottish Enlightenment. He mixed in literary circles and Enlightenment circles. He trained to be a lawyer. He was brought up initially a Scot, but brought up initially in Shropshire, and then trained to be a lawyer and returned to Scotland to work. He became an absolutely committed Tory after a bit of flirting with liberal ideas, which he decided were not for him. And he started writing essays in the late 1810s in Blackwood's magazine, which was the magazine particularly associated with Tories. And Allison's essays were interventions in political debates. Like many people of his generation, he regarded the periodical as a way of making a public intervention. It's like being, well, it's not quite like being on Newsnight because it's a bit more lengthy and serious, but it's that kind of intervention in a public debate. He wasn't in Parliament, but he was writing for the Parliament of the periodicals. And his passionate opposition to the reform of Parliament, the reform of the franchise, and to the abolition of slavery were hallmarks of his writing from the 1820s onwards. So he became an identifiable figure as a leading Tory, the most committed Tory you could imagine. His argument about slavery from the 1820s, the late 1820s, was that slavery was a necessary step on the road to progress. And this was an argument which had been made all through the 18th century by defenders of slavery. So it was nothing new, but he's making it in the context of a huge public movement for abolition. That's what's different in by 1830. Allison argued that Africans were in need of protection. They were savages. It was a progressive thing to take them from Africa and take them to the Caribbean, and that the plantation would act as a civilizing place for them. And he makes these arguments from the 1820s onwards. Africans were incapable of understanding freedom. They could not work without discipline and coercion. And the evidence for this, the crucial evidence for this, was in the rebellion, the revolution in Saint-Domingue, and the creation of the state of Haiti. This was what stood as the exemplum of what went wrong when the enslaved rose and whites were disappeared from the new state of Haiti. So in 1833, Archibald Allison appears in our database about the slave owners because he acted as a trustee for his brother-in-law, who did own enslaved men and women in Antigua. So there he is on our website, if you have a look. Well, in the 30s and 40s, he wrote a 10-volume, first of all a 10-volume, then another 5-volume history of Europe. And the main story in this history was that the French Revolution had been an absolute and total disaster, that democracy was a dreadful mistake, that innovation of any kind was to be avoided, that the terrible insurrection in Saint-Domingue was a demonstration of how the abolition of slavery was a terrible mistake. Haiti had collapsed during the revolution. Vile crimes, never specified of course, but vile crimes had been committed. There had been a collapse into savage life following the success of the revolution. By the time his 8-volume continuation was published in the 1850s, his ideas about slavery had become much more acceptable in Britain. This was after the so-called Great Experiment of Emancipation had been shown by systematic propaganda from the plantation owners to be less than a perfect success. So whereas in the 1830s the abolition movement had convinced the majority of the British public that abolition would be followed by economic success in these newly free societies, and that plantation societies would be transformed and would operate successfully economically, politically and culturally, the slave owners and their descendants systematically argued that this was not the case, that economically it had been a disaster, that Africans would not work, and they were very successful in their propaganda efforts in Britain. So slavery became something that it was much more possible to talk about in Britain by the 1850s. And his later volumes exemplify this. Again, he is explicit about how slavery should be understood as a step on the road, a necessary step on the road to civilization. He was an avid supporter of the South in the American Civil War, and again making those same arguments. Slavery was part of the system of nature. Africans could not work without being trained by Europeans. It was a hopeless illusion that all men were equal. Africans were made for service. So that is one of the stories, one of the paradigms that is being produced in this large-scale historical work. Well, Thomas Babington Macaulay is a rather different matter, but a complicated matter too. Macaulay, a little bit younger than Archibald Allison, born in 1800, and his father was a leading abolitionist, a man called Zachary Macaulay, who had worked himself for a while on a plantation in Jamaica, came back convinced of the horrors of slavery, and devoted his life to the abolition of the slave trade and slavery. He was a very close aide of William Wilberforce and a great propagandist and collector of information, an incredibly hard worker for the cause of abolition. Zachary Macaulay was a very serious evangelical. He was not a man given to jokes or fun. He took his work and his life and his own shortcomings and the shortcomings of everybody else very, very seriously. So he wasn't the easiest father to have. So Macaulay, Tom Macaulay, grew up in this with this rather dour father and a very, very loving and domesticated mother. His father was mostly either absent or sitting over his books. His mother was the one who was at the heart of the household. And Tom had 8 younger brothers and sisters, all of whom were very much under his influence. He was the leader of the pack. He was King Tom. He was clever, bright, funny, witty, very, very good with words, produced rhymes, at the drop of a hat, great at games, charades, you name it. They had fun with Tom. And behind their father's back, they would make fun of the degree of his anti-slavery commitments. So growing up in this household, far from becoming committed abolitionists, they became rather lukewarm towards abolition. When Tom was a young man, he was a very, very, very clever boy. And he loved being a very clever boy. He liked being top boy at school, and he went to the kind of school where being top boy was very important, being very clever was very important. And he knew he was destined for great things, which his father and mother absolutely believed. He was exceptional in terms of his brilliance. So as a young man, he was wont to rather parrot his father, in public at least, and at a very famous anti-slavery meeting, he stood up and made a speech which all the aged abolitionists thought was absolutely wonderful, and they all thought, here is the leader of the next generation of abolitionists. But as he became more confident and more separate from his father, he was clearer about his less than enthusiastic commitment to abolitionism. He was certainly against slavery and a great believer in freedom, but he did not believe in the equality of Africans, and he certainly thought that there were racial hierarchies which needed to be retained in place. So in 1833, Macaulay was a very successful young politician. He was in the Whig cabinet, which negotiated the deal with the slave owners over compensation. And he was torn because he was being pushed by his father to try and drive the hardest bargain he could for the abolitionists. He was being pushed by the Whig cabinet to make concessions to the West India interest, the slave owners. He found this a very, very difficult situation, which he had to negotiate. So Macaulay decided quite early in life that he was going to write a great history. Indeed, aged 8, he was practicing writing. He wrote a universal history when he was 8, which his mother and father were very, very proud of. So by the time he was in his 30s, he was quite sure that this was what he was going to do. And after the moment of abolition, he went to India for 4 years, where he acted as the major advisor, the law member for the Governor General. So very significant position in India. And his encounter with India absolutely confirmed him in his understanding of the necessity of racial hierarchies and the differences between them and us. And he did not falter in this. He believed that those differences could be eradicated over generations through the activities of civilizers. So the notion of a civilizing mission, of the ways in which Africans, Indians, any other, the Scots, the Irish, all of these people who were less advanced than the English, all of them could eventually become like us, the English, as long as they learnt English culture and English civilization. And that was he was very significant in the development of colonial policy in India, in introducing English as the first language. So, having left India, he began to write his history. But in addition to his understanding of racial hierarchies and his clarity about the relation between them and us, was his sense of his own complicated situation in his family and the love affair that he had had with his 2 sisters. He was passionately fond of 2 of his younger sisters, both of whom he thought would stay with him throughout his life, that they would always be with him. They were much younger than him. They absolutely adored him, and both of whom deserted him and married other men. And he had a breakdown in the context of this emotional trauma. And in coming out of this breakdown, which happened when he was in India, he came to believe that reading and writing were the sources of life for him. That real emotional life was too difficult, it was too painful. Love and loss were too painful, and so he would devote himself to his imagined life in his writing. And his book became, The History of England, became his child. It became the source of his emotional life. And the book was something he could control, something he could contain. Dead people didn't speak back, as he so eloquently wrote about in his letters. You could keep them in place in a way that you could not keep your errant sisters in place, or indeed others who were involved in all kinds of acts of rebelliousness, whether it was labourers in England or in Scotland, or Africans in Jamaica, or Indians in India. So the story he tells in his history is a story of progress and containment, that England has been transformed from barbarism to civilization, and that in this transformation, everybody has done well. There are no losers. There's no class antagonism in this account. There's no colonial colonizers or colonized. They all disappear from the history. And the history is a smooth progress towards prosperity, security, and a good life under Victoria for all. So what I'm suggesting is that Macaulay's story is driven both by his own emotional and psychic needs and by his understanding or his failure to understand difference. He could not encompass difference. People had to come to be the same. To be white, to be English, to be cultured and civilized was the thing to be. Okay, well, in that story, there is no place for the Caribbean, which was what his father had been completely preoccupied with, despite the fact that the history is about the period from the 17th century onwards. It scarcely appears in the 5 volumes. There's no place for the slave trade. There's no place for the slavery business. The only place for slavery is abolition. So abolition is the story of what England has done. So on the one hand, we have Alison's story of slavery as a necessity. On the other hand, we have Macaulay's story of forget it all, it's all disappeared, what we have is abolition. This is the thing to remember. And this is the contestation over memory, which we can replay again and again and again in different contexts. Thank you.
Thank you for your invitation to speak with my bad French accent. I'm sorry for that. I'm very happy to speak after Catherine, because subject will cross between our two presentations, and then we could see that France and England, which are always or sometimes present as enemies, has a great connection about the idea of slavery, abolition, and civilization at the same time. Well, maybe I will start from the nowadays, and to say that in recent times, the social coherence of European societies have been at issue with regard to the heritage of the memory of colonial slavery. Even if there has been a broad spectrum of interrogation at various levels of social urgency and demand, extending from nearly silence to laws on memories, debates have been shaking all European society, whose prosperity relied at some point in their history on the slave trade, slavery, and colonization. Historically, the colonial slave trade and slavery contribute to elaborating and consolidating the definition of Europe from an economical, cultural, and intellectual point of view. First, as Catherine said, through the discussion of human domination, then through the construction of the notion of freedom, this term on concrete meaning with the development of the campaigns against the slavery of the people from Africa. Regarding the globalization of the claims made by countries of the South to countries of the North, claims in which slavery occupies a central role, a local change in the registers of memory have emerged in the last 10 years. Thanks to the information circulation provided by the Internet, the analysis any more accurate and the back and forth between the local, national, and global are more constant. We will explore these different points in the frameworks of France through the interaction between race, construction of black and white and its legacies, and the Republic in France, and through the question of reparation due from colonial slavery. As Catherine said, slavery is a very polysemy, and maybe the difference and the way to answer to the person who say that slavery, that Africans committed slavery, is the fact to insist on the is the way to make the difference between different type of slavery is to insist that transatlantic slavery constructed races. And that makes really the difference, because we are talking about legacies, and the proper legacies of slavery in contemporary world is really this opposition, connection between black, the construction of black and the construction of white due to the colonial slavery. So that will be maybe my first point, because I really want to stress this point, because in France also we have these debates. When you present your work on the colonial slavery, there is always person who say, but well, Europe is not responsible for slavery because Africans participate into the system, which is true, except the fact that Africa at this time did not exist as a political, economical entity, and also that the Africans were not existing either. I mean that people who were sold by other persons in Africa were not considered to be the brothers and sisters of the person who sold them. And that makes a difference. When you talk about Europe, you see a lot of different people. So I say it's a kind of utopical to think about global identity as Europe or Africa, especially in the 17th or 18th century. So that's the first point I want to make. As I told, the category of a black person was really constructed through slavery. And during time, and because of the transatlantic slavery, the superposition, the connection, the equivalence in sense between black and slave was constructed. When you took the traveler's account in the Caribbean or in the Americas, they use either black or slave to talk about slave. And why? Because, of course, a slave was a black person. You know, so the synonymy was constructed in this space. It was really investigated by a social scientist, and but what was more or less investigated was the construction of the whiteness and the category of white people, and I will do a small development on this. In the 17th France, when you ask a peasant to define himself or herself, she will not say, I am a black person. The peasant will say, I am from Burgundy, I belong to this part of the France, to this village. But the person will never talk about a question of skin color. It is a paradox because at the same time, in the colonial space, the construction of the whiteness was on stake, and the chromatic definition of people had begun. So in French, the term blanc or blanc is coming from German and means light color, but in the 12th and 1st century it was only used for horses, but not at all for person. You could find the word in Jean de La Fontaine in the 17th century when he used the term white, well, the adjective blanc, to define only moral attributes. But in this case, also no skin color at stake. So blanc, white, was an adjective and not a noun, and it became a noun in the colonial space with the confrontation with the non-European population, and more particularly with the people from what was called Négrici, who was a term for Africa. With the same process as the one for black or nigger, because the terms were equivalent, the name was imposed with the development of the traffic of humans and goods organized by Europe from the starting in the 15th century. In the beginning of the colonization, people who participate into the colonization process will define themselves by the name of their nation. They are English, they are French, Portuguese, Spanish, for example. So the first globalization of the trade induced a first homogenization of these actors of colonization. They are characterized as European, and they talk also about themselves as Europeans. Along the path of colonization and with the experience of slavery, the term white, blanc in French, became a status. It is really the development of the plantation system in the America who created the term as a noun with a social, political, and biological dimension in the Spanish, English, and French colony. For example, in the French census, in the French Antilles, in the 17th century, the term white, blanc, is used to designate the free European, but it is only a local use of the term. It is not used, for example, in the Code Noir in 1685, which is a text from the king. You could not find the term white. You will find the term masters, but not white. So really, white and blanc was created by the colonial experience and the confrontation to black slave. But it was not only the case for the French colonies. It was also the case in the English space. In a treaty in 1680, Morgan Godwin explained to an English audience that in Barbados colony, white is a term used to designate the Europeans. You could find the same example in the French colonies. In 1751, Thibaut de Champvallon, who is a planter, a Creole from Martinique, describes the colony of Martinique for the Academy of Science in Paris, and must precise to the audience that Europeans, and I'm quoting, Europeans who are living in Martinique are called black or are called white or blanc. They need to explain this because in the metropolis they don't know what white is. So the construction of a racial identity of whiteness based on the homogeneity of a group who benefit from a juridical status, white free person versus black slave, who benefit from a political position of domination and a large political power, was on the process in the colonies. The frontiers of this group became more and more precise as the miscegenation of people was developed and as the colonial law on the property of human beings and goods was consolidated. The purity of the white blood based on the reputation inside the colonial society was a proof of freedom and a direct path to the status of masters. The black color induced a presumption of servility, But on the contrary, the white collar gave the way to the possibility to be on the position to possess human beings. Laws permitted the political construction of the white class, but by giving her a full citizenship according to historical factors. And that was a kind of a global movement, because in 1790, for example, the Naturalization Act in the United States gave citizenship to persons who live in the States for at least 2 years and who are white. It was right in this act. That could be a first point to stress. So historically, the whiteness is superposed to the European colonization and its political and ideological action. These categories of white and black are colonial categories who came after into the metropolis. Let's note 2 exceptions. The first one is the case of the Irish in Great Britain, who in the 13th century were not considered as free blood. And the so-called, and the second case is the so-called Petit Blanc in the French Antilles, for example, who were living in the same standard that slave. But a kind of a global discourse on these 2 categories were on the table. Despite these 2 examples, it is truly the connection between imperialism and race who explain the stabilization of these categories. A linear hierarchy of race is fixed, and in the scale of the human being, the white is on the top with the charge to ensure the universal progress of humanity and the civilization. Whiteness was also a moral duty, as Rudyard Kipling echoed in a famous poem for his title, more than his contents, called, as you know, The Burden of the White Man. In France, despite the fact that the project of cancelling the term race is on the table these days, the debate on the French identity or on the racism against white, which is a national debate that some intellectuals denounce, show that social and political conflicts are strongly based on race issue. The articulation between universalism and race in France is still problematic, but have to be considered in order to deconstruct races and to invalidate the implicitly so-called race opposition. In order to show how the abolition of slavery in the republican framework of France reinforced the superposition of white as masters and black as slaves, I will turn to the history of the second abolition in France in 1848. On March 4th, 1848, one of the first steps by the Second Republic was to proclaim the abolition of slavery in the French colony. The decision was made right after Victor Schellcher returned to Paris. On April 27, the implementing decree was ready. Within 2 months, there will be no more slaves in any of the French colonies. In a movement of social inclusion, to use Pierre Rosanvallon expression, Republican France will completely assimilate the slaves in the nation. So the colonies could be integrated in the French political body, and join in the metropole historic narrative. It offered political and social equality, full citizenship, right to paid employment, access to land ownership and education, the immediate institution of universal suffrage in the French colony. Freedom and universal suffrage are established that very day of March 4, 1848. This founding act of the Republic not only gives power to the citizenry, but also establishes the foundation of the French community and integrates the colonies with the larger French body, that nation of earth in the city so dear to Michelet. The Republic creates an imaginary community, to use Benedict Anderson's words. On the juridical plane, and in the name of political assimilation, by using the concept of social fusion, reconciliation, forgetting the past, and social regeneration, suppressing the memory of slavery allows a regeneration of the colonies and their integration within the French nation. According to principle of natural law, abolitionists describe the emancipation of slaves as, I quote, a great act of reparation for a crime of inhumanity, as well as France's great debt to humanity. Abolitionism, with Victor Schellcher as its figurehead, have been a central debate among prominent French intellectuals, including De Broglie, Tocqueville, Lamartine, and Victor Hugo, since the early 19th century. Hence, the idea of forgetting the past was created with the abolition of slavery in 1848. This essential republican tenet, by the same token, ended up forgetting slavery in the national meta-narrative by ignoring the past slave experience. In a time when history was becoming a national institution, as Augustin Thierry puts it, and when history had become an integral part of the definition of a national identity, this absence, as evident in history books, eventually revealed the non-thoughts of the Republic and the fault lines of universalism. French Republic was constructed on forgetting the past, but not on forgetting the race, in terms of meta-discourse and also experience. Abolition was not deconstructing race. Abolition did not question race, but on the contrary, reinforce it by solidifying the superposition between white civilized and black slave by putting civilization as an objective. And I will find a kind of parallel, but also opposition between the English path you described and the French path. But it's very interesting to see the joint point. Well, but let's back to the fault lines of universalism. I will take two examples which are central to the history of the late 18th and mid-19th century France, the two abolitions of slavery. The first, as we well know, as decided in 1793, following the slave revolution in Saint-Domingue, that forced the convention in Paris to abolish slavery in all colonies in 1794. The second abolition of slavery was decided during the restoration of the Second Republic and as a consequence of the pressures exerted by abolitionist philanthropy, the economy, because the sugar beet production taking away an important part of the world market from colonial sugarcane, and the yearning for freedom by slaves through the Caribbean, which led in the later part of the 18th century to a series of uprisings in the colonies. Yet, and despite these two major facts, history books about France omit the Saint-Domingue Revolution, which caused the collapse of the colonial project of Napoleon. They ignore the abolition of slavery in 1848 and its scope, which gave de facto citizenship and nationality to the former slave, now new freedmen, who had the right to universal suffrage and the right to full French citizenship. In virtually all accounts from the Third Republican historian, including Michelet and Renan, including Augustin Thierry, Guizot, and Mignet, the role of the Caribbean colonies in the French Revolution is simply absent, when in fact the revolution in Saint-Domingue was instrumental in clarifying the terms liberty, equality, fraternity. This is complete silence in La Vis, while senior boss, Republican historians, limits the French nation to the continental France uniquely, and the notion of race to whites exclusively, with the two concepts overlapping. This made understand that this causality being posited as natural, the French nation have been unable up to now to integrate the peoples of the Caribbean, who are those who are black or mixed blood, into the majority and the national we. But let's go back to the 19th century and the reinstauration of the Third Republic in France to listen Victor Hugo in 1879. For him, as for Republicans, the abolition of slavery was a way to improve the human race. And we find echoes to what you say, Catherine. Freedom encouraged the development of qualities and the end of the evils caused by slavery, that is to say, thefts, liars, stupidity, vagrancy, irresponsibility, and non-married relationship. The newly freed men and women of the Antilles were proof of that. Emancipated by the Republic, they have gained all the qualities of freedmen and freedwomen. During the meeting for the commemoration of the abolition of slavery, for example, in 1873, this philanthropy in the name of the improvement of the human race is announced. The progress induced by the Republic was part of an evolutionist perspective with a hierarchy of people and continents. The Republic considered itself to be in charge of a duty of civilization through the colonization of Africa. And I will show you only. Oops. Ça, je ne sais pas comment on fait. Comment fait-on? Oh yes, this was a map of the Caribbean because to situate my talk, and you see Martinique and Guadeloupe, small point. Oh, this one is yes, I forgot to show you this. Castas in the Spanish America, which is a kind of inventing or presenting all type of people who are mixed all together. In France, you have the classification of Moreau de Saint-Méry, but it's not painting, it's word, so I prefer to put this to show you how the racial categories were created in this colonial space. And this is a text of Victor Hugo, and I will say it in French, but maybe it will be easier for you to read it on the screen. So you have to remember that it's at the commemoration of slavery, of the abolition of slavery in Paris, 1879. And Victor Hugo say, il est là devant vous ce bloc de sable et de cendres, ce monceau inerte et passif qui depuis 6000 ans fait obstacle à la marche universelle. Ce monstrueux cham qui arrête sème par son énormité, l'Afrique. Allez peuple, emparez-vous de cette terre, prenez-la, à qui? À personne. Prenez cette terre à Dieu. Dieu donne la terre aux hommes, Dieu offre l'Afrique à l'Europe, prenez-la. Versez votre trop-plein dans cette Afrique et du même coup résolvez vos questions sociales. Changez vos prolétaires en propriétaires. Allez, faites des routes, faites des ports, faites des villes. Croissez, cultivez, colonisez, multipliez. Et que sur cette terre, de plus en plus dégagée des prêtres et des princes, l'esprit divin s'affirme par la paix et l'esprit humain par la liberté. It's a text very very strong, and but who shows that there was no contradiction between acting for the emancipation of slaves in the Caribbean and colonizing and going to colonize Africa. Because the idea who sustained all this movement was that the hierarchy of race was a reality, and that black people has to be civilized. But I will stress this fact. I will only say that in this process of the civilization of Africa, the Antilles and the French Antilles played a role because they were emancipated and because they proved that they could be full citizens. The Republicans used this argument in order to colonize Africa, because the idea was to eradicate slavery in Africa and to take the example of the Antilles to prove that if you abolish slavery in Africa, you could put people on the way to civilization. It's true that Republic build up equality, give citizenship, but for the black people in the Antilles, it was what Paul Ricoeur called an horizon d'attente. It was for the future, but not exactly for the present. So colonization of Africa was justified by the success of erasing slavery in the French Caribbean and of producing supposedly equal citizens between ex-masters and ex-slaves. And I will jump to my conclusion, I think, because it will be too long. I will just want to say on the question of reparation and indemnity. For Republican, the reparation to slavery was the abolition of slavery and was the status of citizen gave to the Antilles, the French Antilles. The question of indemnity was another matters, and as you might say, the question of indemnity in the French case was built on the two levels. The first one was the indemnity for Haiti in 1825 when France, it was not the Republican, but Charles X, who asked the Haitian state to pay back all the property of the French people in Haiti. And Haiti paid until from 1825 to 1880 this debt to France. And this is a political issue these days in France. The second indemnity process in France was the payment of the indemnity to the ex-masters in the French Antilles. So it was not the people who fled from Martinique, Guadeloupe, Réunion, and Guyana, but it was the ex-masters who stayed in these colonies and who were paid back by for the price of the human being they own prior. This question also emerged recently in France in a political debate, and maybe we will talk about that in with the question. But I would like to say in conclusion that under the question of indemnity, which is on the table in France these days, I make the hypothesis that it's a question of race who is on the table, and with underlying also this question of indemnity. The question of race and the question of the non-resolution of discrimination and racism in France. There are different positions on this question, and I will say more about this, but it's on the table. These questions are on the table, and they have to be taken very seriously, and they have to be investigated very seriously for two reasons. Because there is a need to deconstruct the racial question, who sustain the question of repentancy. I'm not sure about this word in English. And because the acceptance of race favored the deconstruction of race. What I want to say, it's that the position in France was, because of the universalism, not to talk about race, but at the opposite, not talking about race, cause problem to deracialize the Republic. You know, it was, we are not talking about race, but at the same time there are discrimination, there are racism, and it's a way not to solve the problem. And I think it's it's a very important issue. And I will conclude with a reference to late Stuart Hall, to whom I would like to pay a tribute, and to Gilroy and Achille Mbembe, who deconstruct the notion of blackness and who have showed that blackness was a kind of universal concept. I would like to stress the fact that it's very important to put blackness explicitly in relation to whiteness, in order to show that all racial categories are colonial and connected to Atlantic slavery. Slavery constructed black, white, and Indians, as it was more recently showed by studies in the America. Putting these categories in connection with slavery, considered in its political, economical, anthropological fact, is a way to construct freedom with a non-racial perspective. Thank you.
Could either of you tell us just a little bit about what Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands did? I have a vague idea that Portugal abolished slavery after, am I right?
Portugal never abolished slavery. There is no law of abolition of slavery in Portugal until now.
Yeah. So Portugal always had slavery, or you just let it go without actually formally abolishing it?
Yes, yes. They transform the relationship in a. Or would you like to answer? I don't.
No, carry on.
To the servant relationship, and it just disappeared because it was non-acceptable in the Western world at a certain point. But there was no in the Western world because the other European country had laws of abolition of slavery. So the Portugal did not make.
I'm not asking so in order to know more, and of course I can very good find you a lot more. I'm trying to understand how this debate, what were the parameters of the debate, and there was the debate, and undoubtedly there were also very powerful economic factors which we haven't considered. I'm just wondering whether the same kind of ideological, intellectual, cultural parameters operated in all colonial powers in Europe, or whether they were very different. This is why I would like to know a little bit about what Spain and Portugal and possibly the Netherlands did with their slaves.
I think that may be a very large question. Hands popping up. I think it might be a good idea if we collected a few questions and then gave both speakers a chance to reply to a lot of them. Otherwise, we're in danger of having long discussions of one point. There's a lady at the back. So I'll collect 2 or 3 now. Yeah.
I just would like to add that I am Portuguese, and legally there was legislation. Slavery was abolished in Portugal in 1757, but unfortunately it did carry on. Even my own great-grandfather had slaves, and I know stories from my aunts who actually witnessed him being killed by his own slaves. So it's never abolished.
It was officially abolished, I think you said in 1757, but went on, and your great-grandfather owned slaves.
Legislation said that they abolished in 1757, but it went on until the early 1900s.
On Portugal, I just want to add that, of course, there seems to be a slight confusion as to whether we're talking about whether Portugal, the European metropolis, abolished slavery for itself, or whether the Lusophone, the Portuguese-speaking empire, abolished slavery. Remember that Brazil gained its independence, and Brazil, which had 10 times the number of slaves as North America, abolished slavery as the last of all of the, European powers, but it was independent in 1888. So we mustn't forget that the Portuguese, or the Portuguese-speaking peoples, were the very last to abolish Negro slavery. The point I actually want to make is to Professor Cottias. I was very pleased that you placed the emphasis upon the construction of blackness and whiteness through this particular slavery. This is very much the way to respond to those persons who derail the discussion by saying, well, the Africans did it too. The way in which I do try to keep us on track in my own work is by talking about Negro slavery, adopting the term that was used by many persons at the time. I take it that these derailers cannot come back and say, oh, well, the Africans engaged in Negro slavery too. No, the Africans did not engage in the construction of blackness and whiteness. However, just one last sentence. You said that the indemnity or the compensation that France demanded from Haiti in 1825 went on until, I think you said something like 1880 or 1870. So according to the BBC website, the figure of 150 million francs was reduced to 90 million, but was still not paid off until 1947. That's incorrect, or?
No. I know that it's written, but it's 18 because after this indemnity is the indemnity coming after the American invasion, the U.S. invasion. So the indemnity after the U.S. invasion was paid by Haiti until the mid 20th century. But for
Set of compensation.
yes.
Yes, I would like to thank Myriam Cottias once again for putting the emphasis on whiteness, because I would just like to give a very quick anecdote. One of my colleagues, who's also an anthropologist, is half Iranian, I think, and his father is French, and his father's last name is the same as a very famous last name in Guadeloupe. So people would ask him if he was white. And his response to that was, well, of course I'm white, how come they can ask me that? And I think it was very problematic because growing up in the West Indies, I know that a lot of people look white and people know their family histories and people know that they are not white. So I think it's very interesting to put the emphasis on whiteness and deconstructing whiteness. And I had two questions, one for Catherine Hall. I don't remember the names of the two authors you mentioned. I think it was Archibald Allison and Thomas Macaulay. Macaulay, okay. I was wondering if they were using the words race, the categories, the notions of race or ethnic group or what kind of categories they were using to refer to what we call today race. And also I wanted to know, Myriam, I know that you've been engaged in a lot of discussions with people who study slavery, not only in Europe, but also in Africa. And I know that there are other forms of otherness that are implied in slavery in Africa. And my question is, can we consider that there's some form of racialization as well, even though it doesn't imply a white-black dichotomy, if there is some sort of racialization in African slavery?
I'm just a little bit concerned about this perspective that there has been a return of this discussion in the last few years. I remember going back, I think, to the 1970s, reading about topics of, just to take reparations, for example, coming from the people living the legacy of slavery in the southern United States and so on. Pamphlets and campaigning organisations, they've always been there. Now, there was mention of the internet, Hollywood, and so on. I'm just a little bit concerned that this new phase of interest, which has been referred to specifically as the last 10 years or maybe a bit more with the internet and so on, represents a kind of an attempt, the word globalization was used as well, to rather kind of take over the voice from the people living that legacy themselves and incorporate it into globalization means domination of the United States media and other Western media and so on, within the world of people constructed as white. I'm just trying to say the voice of the people constructed of blacks maybe being neglected.
Well, it's just interesting that you talk about those who live the legacy. My parents come from the Caribbean, and your parents presumably come from Britain. But that doesn't mean we don't live the legacy. We all live the legacy. You know, your racial identity is as much a construct of the times that these people we've been speaking about as your idea of what mine is. So there is nobody on the planet who doesn't live the legacy, really. If you're connected to anybody else on the planet, we're all infected with the same germ, unfortunately.
Yeah, I probably expressed it wrong. The point I was making was about globalized media, where there will tend to be more of a voice from a domination of white corporations and so on, white-dominated corporations and so on, rather than a lot of the kind of non-black people who've been campaigning and developing their own voice for a long time.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that's been really interesting about both of the talks today was that they actually unify the ideas, so that we've talked about the origins of racial identity. We've talked about where that corporate voice originates from. So our distinction of what a white-dominated voice is and what you think might not be a white-dominated corporate voice are actually they're actually indivisible. They're two halves of the same, which is an artificial notion created in order to expedite production of sugar and tobacco and indigo and the rest of it. So what we're talking about is a conversation that you're having with yourself. You have the tools to analyse and make relevant comments about that corporate voice within yourself. It's not a question of somebody having the validation to do so because of the colour of their skin, although their family history may be different. We've all got access to the same knowledge. If you want to, you're quite able to understand that and to make a cogent remark about it as anybody, whether white, black, or of any other origin. So, this idea that there's a sort of special hallowed place for those who are the descendants of the enslaved people is actually part of the problem. You're talking about people as though they're victims now. They're not, we aren't victims, and you, any more than you are, we're all victims, or I'd rather put it that way, we're all victims of it. So I'm a little bit concerned about the 70s ideas, the preciousness, and the debate has continued around reparations. Obama was elected talking about reparations. The debate hasn't gone away. You may not have heard the cry, but it hasn't actually gone away. And it's cropped up again now because of CARICOM's initiative. This is really just a question of you applying your own views to it. I'm sorry, I don't want to turn it into my lecture because you didn't come with it. I just wanted to say that.
Well, I completely agree with what you were just saying, that we're all living the legacies in different ways, because the legacy, in a sense, the most important legacy is inequality of many different kinds, and racial inequality is one of those central forms of inequality. But we're living that in Britain quite as much as people are living it in the Caribbean. We're all what Michael Rothberg calls implicated subjects. None of us are outside of the net of colonialism in its widest forms, because we're all living in that world that colonialism created. So it's all our responsibility, wherever you are. I'm absolutely in agreement about that. I think it's very important to be careful about distinguishing between kinds of slavery and recognizing that slavery has existed for as long as we have any forms of human history that we know about. But there are many different kinds of slavery, and plantation slavery, chattel slavery, what you're calling Negro slavery, is a very particular form. And let's forget that there are 23 million slaves, enslaved people in the world today. But they're not chattel slaves in the way that people were on the plantations in the Caribbean or in the United States. So thinking carefully about the different forms of slavery and what is economically useful and politically possible at different times is a very important part of knowing the history. And I suppose one of the things that I think is really significant about the British Empire, or that the British Empire gives us access to, is the many different forms of racialization which aren't only associated with chattel slavery. They're associated with other forms of exploitation and domination. So there was never chattel slavery in India, but there are racial hierarchies in India for absolutely sure, or in Sri Lanka, or in, you know, the different, so what we need to think about is the different forms of domination and subordination. But one of the things that is the thread running through all of that is indeed white domination and the ways in which whiteness is privileged. So knowing when we're talking about the Caribbean, when we're talking about different parts of Africa, when we're talking about India, when we're talking about Ireland, but we're talking about systems of exploitation and legacies of inequality, which we all live with today.
Yes, thank you. I would like to stress one point to answer to your question. All European countries participated in the Atlantic slavery. Even countries we don't think about, like Sweden, Denmark, and so it was really a European project, and it's a reason why at the beginning I thought that European, as an identity, as an entity, political and economical entity, was built up also on slavery, because it was really a big participation of all these countries. I do agree with Catherine about different type of slavery and how we have to think about human domination. I will say that it was in France. It was also a debate, and we have a special issue in a review called L'Histoire, and the title was "Slavery is Human." So, which was quite striking. So, the idea was to show that slavery was everywhere, in every place and every time. And for me, it's a little bit difficult to think like this. I mean, if we are talking about domination and power struggles, thank you, forces. Okay, I do agree, and it's our duty as citizens to think about people who are exploiting for the clothes we wear, and but at the same time, and I turn back to what I said before. The Atlantic slavery really built up this opposition of race. And I will not call the Atlantic slavery Negro slavery, but I call this slavery racialized slavery, to show that really it was the historical issue when it was built up. And I prefer this term than Negro slavery, really. Of course, in Africa, in the African country where slavery exists, the slave is more often the others, the stranger of the community. And we are working in the CIRESC, my laboratory, with Professor Tube, and he's from Senegal, and he's working on the question of slavery in Africa, and they are working on this question of is there a racialized slavery in Africa, but they don't go to this extent at this point, and of what I say. Okay.
Can I just pick up the point that you made at the back about what terms and it is interesting that Macaulay uses European a lot, and European means white colonizer. That's what it actually means. That's who it's referring to. So that sense of a common project of Europe is very much there in the way in which he writes.
We've gone well beyond time already, but if everybody's happy, I'll take just 2 more questions if everybody's happy with that. Continuing? Yeah, so one there, one here. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just coming in on this because I've heard a couple of things that I find a bit disturbing. In using definitions of what slavery is, I would have thought, and I'm no expert, but really, we need big and easy understandings. There's got to be a legal definition, because if you are defined as not human, that is the key thing. So the word chattel suggests that you have no human rights. You don't exist. You're like cattle. And you have to have, that is the key definition. Other forms are, servitude, servant classes, indentured labor, and so on and so on. There are many, many different types of subordination, but I would have thought, clearly, one has to. I mean, the key thing is if you lose your personhood. And I think that's what people understand worldwide. Before you answer that,
yeah, maybe it relates somehow to what you just said. Speaking of the Spanish slavery, I vaguely remember that in the 1500s something there was a debate in Spain about whether the Indians, so we're speaking of the native Indians of America, thank you, had a soul or not, and therefore could they be, used as animals, etc., etc. So maybe that complements your question. Now my question is more about the fact that, in Europe, if Europe means anything, I'm not sure, say say France and Britain, to make it shorter, we speak about that topic, what's the legacy of slavery in our culture, country, etc., etc. I was wondering to which extent those reflections, debates, etc., are also happening in other civilizations or cultures. Again, I don't know which term to use, but I'm thinking specifically like the Arabic culture, for example, that's been involved in slavery a lot. The Turks, the Persians, you name it. Because maybe those are the words that might not be written, maybe. So yeah, I would be interested to hear what your points are. And why do we think that it's so important, and maybe the other ones, maybe, I don't know, maybe not so much.
Maybe the we and the other is problematic.
I know, it's...
But there is one very clear reason why those questions have come up in Britain and France, which is because of the previously colonized populations who are now part of our contemporary population. I mean, that's why I would absolutely argue that that's why it's the presence of peoples who were colonized coming in now part of this society, asking questions about race. That's how it's changed from being, small groups writing pamphlets to being big political questions. 2007 would never have happened if there hadn't been a large black population in Britain asking questions about their history. It just wouldn't have happened. In 1933, there was no big public events around the centenary. So, there's always, that's what I was saying, there's always questions, there's always people talking about slavery and arguing about it. But what's different is when it becomes a significant political issue, and then politicians have to respond, and it becomes a matter of public debate in a different way. And that's what I would argue had happened in post the 90s in Britain, when the black presence in Britain just became much more vocal, much more confident, and much more troubled about the history and what was being taught in schools, or rather what wasn't being taught in schools, what still isn't being taught in universities, which, unless we're lucky, will be taught even less in schools and in universities. Not lucky, unless we really, really keep going about the importance of these matters. So it's always a question of politics, the extent to which these questions surface.
On this point, Catherine, I will add that in France, France voted a law in 2001 called Loi Taubira, where France declared that slavery was a crime against humanity. That was the first article. The second article was that slavery and slave trade has to be taught in the school, and that the university research has to be sustained on this question. And Christiane Taubira is from French Guyana, and so it was also a political process who put this question on the table. Excuse me, on the chattel slavery, I will tell you that in France it's impossible to translate chattel slavery.
Well, it is an old-fashioned word, yeah, we don't use it either.
No.
You could say property.
No, so the reflection...
What is chattel? What's the
Le
word?
bétail.
Oui, oui.
Yeah, just goods and chattel, my property. My tables, my chairs, my cattle, my slaves. All the same thing.
Yes.
But I don't know, I'm a bit troubled by what you said, because I think that particular notion of personhood is to do with that history of slavery and the denial of a particular form of individual personhood. That you own your person, that's the definition of freedom in Western societies. So anyway,
Well, I mean, you'd be killed for nothing, for free, for nothing. You know what I mean? You're not a person. That's what I meant.
I think at this point,
we could pursue it.
What we should do is thank our speakers for raising such a fascinating set of questions, really stimulating lectures and discussion. So thank you as well for contributing to the discussion. It's quite clear that what we need is more of that very precise, very analytic, but also very engaged history that we've seen demonstrated tonight. So I'm very grateful for you all. To you all for coming, and particularly grateful to our speakers for demonstrating precisely the ways in which we need to continue thinking about these issues and developing our understanding. So thank you.